What's up guys, it's MTG Matt for you with a brand new video, and today we're going to be looking at the new Venture into the Dungeon mechanic of the upcoming Magic the Gathering expansion, Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. So I just wanted to make a quick video about this, give my 2 cents about it. And there was this post by the Magic Twitter, right, about what's it called? Idol of the Forgotten Realms. It seems to be some kind of game associated with Dungeons and Dragons. And I made a video where they previewed this Planeswalker card. So this card is going to be in Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. And as I'm doing this video, it's 5 p.m. here in Germany. So you might already be able to pre-order the expansion on MTG Arena. I'm gonna check this out later. And so in this video, right, these guys reveal not only this Planeswalker, but also some other cards, which is cool. And most importantly, they explained the new Venture into the Dungeon mechanic, which we're going to have in the upcoming expansion. And to understand this, I think it's easiest, let's just start with new fresh cards, because that's what we're all excited about, that's what we're here for, right? So we're gonna be getting this green Planeswalker called Ellewick Tumblestone. It's a 4-mana 4-loyalty Planeswalker in green. And she has a +1 which says Venture into the dungeon. And it has a reminder text saying enter the first room or advance to the next room. We're gonna be talking about this mechanic just in a few moments. Then she has a -2. Look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them and put it into your hand. If it's legendary, you gain 3 life. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in the random order. And -7, you get an emblem with creatures you control have trample and haste and get +2/+2 for each differently named dungeon you've completed. Now on the surface, obviously, this card doesn't make a lot of sense without knowing about the Venture into the Dungeon mechanic. So let's talk about it. In the second tab, I have Hive open here. So this is the Magic the Gathering page where they in detail explain the mechanic, and I'm gonna break it down to the best of my ability. So with the upcoming expansion, we're going to have cards that say if this and this happens, venture into the dungeon, right? As you've seen on this Ellewick Planeswalker, you +1 her, and then you venture into the dungeon. What this means is there are going to be 3 unique dungeons you can choose from. These dungeons, they don't go into your deck, and also they don't take up space in the sideboard, right? So you basically just have them ready in your sideboard, but they don't take up space there, right? And what happens is 2 scenarios can occur when you play a card that makes you venture into a dungeon. The first scenario is you haven't gone into a dungeon yet, in which case you would take one of these 3 dungeons, you get to choose which one, and then you go into the first room, which is how they call how you progress through these dungeons, right? So you don't have a dungeon yet, you venture into the dungeon the first time, and then you pick one of these 3 dungeons, put it onto the battlefield in some kind of separate zone, and then you get to enter the first room of the dungeon. And whenever you enter a new room of a dungeon, be it the first one or subsequent ones, the effect triggers that you can see on the dungeon cards. So if you take a look at, for example, the leftmost dungeon, which is called Lost Mine of Pendelver, here you got a cave entrance, right? So this is where you would start when you venture first time into a dungeon. And you get to scry 1. Very simple, right? If we take a look at the other dungeons, for Tomb of Annihilation, each player loses 1 life the first time you get into it, and for Dungeon of the Man Mage, you gain 1 life. Okay, so in case you had not had a dungeon yet on the battlefield for which you can progress, you just enter the first room. At all times, you can only have 1 dungeon on the board. You can have multiple dungeons on the board, which means so you pick one, right? You pick one first, and then you get into this first room. And then every time you play a card that says venture into a dungeon, or let's say every time you have an effect that lets you venture into a dungeon, you progress through these dungeons, which is marked through these little white arrows here, right? So let me actually zoom in a bit. I think you can see this better, yeah. So let's just keep my voice cracked there a bit. Let's just keep going with the leftmost dungeon here as an example. So you've already entered the dungeon, right? Because you ventured into the dungeon once, and then you venture again, and then you get to choose how do I want to progress. So in Lost Mine of Pandalfur, whatever, you have 2 rooms to choose from. So you venture into the dungeon the second time. You get to choose to either go into the Goblin Lair, which means you create a 1 red Goblin creature token, or you get to go into the Mine Tunnels, which lets you create a treasure token. And this logic just goes on. Every time you venture into the dungeon, you progress 1 room of your choice, until the last time you venture into a dungeon, you reach the final room, which in this case is Temple of Dumathoin. And in this case, you draw a card, and then the dungeon counts as completed, right? And when the dungeon counts as completed, and you venture into a dungeon again, you can choose a different dungeon to start and hopefully complete. Now, actually, while I'm speaking, I don't know if you can just go through this same dungeon several times. I assume probably not. Does it say it's here? Put the dungeon in the command zone. Reach the final room. Okay, so I guess probably you can only complete 1 dungeon once, right? So you choose one, you complete it, and then the next time you venture into a dungeon, you have to choose a different dungeon. That's how I assume it works, and I think it makes sense, okay? So, I hope you understood how this venture into a dungeon mechanic works, right? You choose between those different dungeons, and then you get benefits doing so. And I'm actually mainly wanted to do this video to just discuss this mechanic, right? So first a little explanation, and then just discuss, like in my opinion, how impactful is this mechanic going to be, or how good is it going to be? So we took the leftmost dungeon as an example. Let's stick with it, right? Let's see what are the rewards for playing out this dungeon mechanic, because, you know, just remind you, if you want to benefit from the stuff, you need to have a decent amount of venture into dungeons cards in your deck to get the benefits, right? Because obviously the benefits get a little better the more you progress throughout the dungeon. So if you take Lost Mine of Pandalfur, for example, the first time you venture, you scry 1, so a very minor effect. It's just nice to have, right? The second time you get a token or a treasure token. Now I think this is already very interesting, because in an aggressive deck, you basically get a free token, which is cool. In a not aggressive deck, which is maybe more mid-rangey or more control-y, you get to ram with a treasure token, which I think is really, really nice. Also, keep in mind, we do have synergies with, specifically with treasure tokens in the meta, through the likes of Goldspan Dragon and Gallows of Prismari, right? So that's pretty cool. Then, let's look at the rooms that you would go into the third time you venture into a dungeon. You have Storeroom, put a 1/1 counter on target creature. Again, this is okay for an aggressive deck. Dark Pearl, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. This might be interesting for like Witherbloom decks, right? To trigger life gain triggers or loss of life triggers. And then you got Fungi Cavern, target creature gets -4, -0 until your next turn. This is also just a payoff for a more control type of deck, okay? And then the last room, it's Temple of Dumathoin, you just get to draw a card, which is always good. So, just telling from this first dungeon, I think the first dungeon is more suited for an aggressive deck. The first effect of Scry 1 is really negligible for an aggressive deck. However, I still want to state that if you are an aggressive deck using this dungeon, then you need to scry very early, make sure that you can maybe curve out, right? Get your more of the sky clays, more consistent, you know, just you want to have these consistent aggressive play styles by curving out, right? So scrying can help. But then already you get a Goblin token. I think getting a treasure token is not that interesting for an aggressive deck. And then you can put a 1/1 counter on target creature and then you get to draw a card. And while we're talking about this first dungeon, without even looking about taking a look at the other two dungeons, I think I already noticed something that I think really gonna make or break this mechanic. So obviously, we haven't seen enough cards to see how consistent you can pull off this dungeon mechanic, because the way I look at these payoffs, right, because they are payoffs in a way, is that the payoffs are going to be very bad if it's rather hard to venture into a dungeon. And let me explain what I mean by this, right? Obviously, if Wizards of the Coast decides to make such a mechanic, they're going to put, like hopefully, going to put enough cards into the expansion that allows you to venture into the dungeon. But the thing about venturing into the dungeon is that I think the cards you get need to be so consistent that you can get through a dungeon quickly in order to justify replacing better cards you might have in your deck with cards that let you venture into the dungeon, right? This is like it's a very classic case of opportunity cost, but when building your Magic deck, is that, okay, we have this cool mechanic here, but is it better than what we have available? And obviously, after this expansion, everybody's going to be rating for rotation in not in March, in autumn, in September, right? So this is going to change up a lot, but we're still going to be talking in the context of the current standard meta. And my take on, for example, Lost Mine of Pendlefer is that if I can play, let's say, an aggressive mono-white deck, or let's say an aggressive mono-red deck, that lets me very easily venture into a dungeon by curving out, right? So if we get a 1-drop that lets you venture into a dungeon, and a 2-drop that lets you venture into a dungeon, and a 3-drop that lets you venture into the dungeon, by turn 3 you can already have reached the third room, which means that by turn 3 you will going to have, in case of an aggressive deck, scryed 1, created a token, and have put a 1/1 counter on target creature. And I think, hopefully you understand what I mean, that if you can do all of this stuff without sacrificing, you know, too much of other good cards you might be able to play, then I think the venture mechanic could be really good and really powerful, because, you know, if venturing into a dungeon is like, let's say, like an incidental payoff of playing cards that are just good by themselves, then, you know, just incidentally scrying 1, creating a token, put a 1 counter, and at the end draw a card. Seems really good to me, right? But I think this is what's gonna make or break this mechanic. Just if you can get easily through rooms without sacrificing too much while building your deck, then I think this is gonna be really cool. And with that being said, let's look at the other two dungeons, right? Second dungeon is Tomb of Annihilation. First room, trapped entry, each player loses 1 life. So obviously nice for an aggressive deck. Then you can choose to either go into Veils of Fear or Oubliette. So Veils of Fear says each player loses 2 life unless they discard a card. Again, a good reward for an aggressive deck. Speaking of mono red, right? You just drain your opponent even more than you already do. Or Oubliette says discard a card and sacrifice an artifact, a creature, and a land. Discard a card and sacrifice an artifact, a creature, and a land. Wait, what? So all of this, you have to do all of this. You have to discard a second artifact, which you might not have, but you probably have a creature and a land. Okay, Oubliette seems crazy. I mean, I could imagine that maybe there are going to be cards where you kind of go through the same dungeon with your opponent, and then this effect applies to him as well. This might be something they plan on doing. But obviously, if you're an aggressive deck, you're just gonna go into the second room Bears of Fears, have your opponent lose 2 life because he probably won't discard a card. And then you go, the third time you go into a Sandfall Cell. Each player loses 2 life unless they sacrifice an artifact, a creature, or a land. So again, just lose 2 life, right? Nice for aggressive decks. And then finally, you reach Cradle of the Death God, create the Atropal, a legendary 4/4 Black God Horror creature token with Death Touch. So really nice payoff here. Just a decent token, 4/4 body, can deal a good amount of damage, and it has Death Touch. And I think right here, like the first dungeon Lost Mine was more ambiguous, right? So you could use this dungeon in aggressive deck, but creating treasure token is life, gaining life is nice, or making a creature have 0 attack is nice for a control deck. So the Lost Mine was more of a mixture of playstyles. I think Tomb is definitely for aggressive decks. You just drain your opponent in the first 3 rooms, and then in the end you get a nice token. So Tomb of Annihilation seems really nice for aggressive decks. And now let's look at the last dungeon, which is the biggest one. And by the way, before we talk about the last one, you can easily just calculate, okay, how many times do I need to venture to a dungeon, right? So first you always need to enter the dungeon, which means you just get into this entry. So let's say Lost Mine, you enter dungeon, you have to do it once, then you go to the second room, have to do it twice, 3 times, 4 times, right? So this first dungeon you can complete with 4 venture into a dungeon triggers, 4. The second one you can also complete with 4 or 3 if you choose Oubliette, but Oubliette is obviously a big downside. So this is 4 or 3. And the last one, Dungeon of the Man Mage, you need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 venture triggers. So this is the biggest dungeon. Let's look at the Dungeon of the Man Mage. So you enter, you gain 1 life. Okay, that's I don't know if you have life gain synergies in Winterbloom or Mono White, that can be useful, but I think this is going to be mostly useful for control decks. You gain a life. Dungeon level, Scry 1. Already, when looking at these 2 rooms, for me this screams control. Then you get to choose between Goblin Bazaar, create a treasure token, or Twisted Caverns, target creature can't attack until your next turn. Yeah, already looking at these 3 rooms, you can clearly see this is really good for a mid-range or a control deck, right? You gain some life, you have some card selection, and then you get to ramp or make so that a creature can't attack until the next turn. Then you go further, Scry 2. Again, just card selection, smoothing out your draws. Then you can choose to go into Runestone Caverns, exile top 2 cards of your library, you may play them. Now, it just says exile top 2 cards of the library, you may play them. It doesn't say until end of turn. So, in a way, this is just draw 2 cards, which is really good. And in a way, exiling is even better than drawing because it doesn't get affected by hand disruption effects, right? So you go into Runestone Caverns, draw 2 cards, basically, or you go into Mural's Graveyard, create 2 1/1 Black Skeleton creature tokens. Yeah, you can just have 2 blockers on the battlefield, which is also nice. So clear this dungeon is for control decks. Then Deep Mine, Scry 3, again, card selection, control. And lastly, Mad Wizard's Lair, draw 3 cards and reveal them. You may cast one of them without paying its mana cost. So the last payoff is absolutely huge, right? You draw 3 cards, which is already bonkers, and then you get to play one of them without paying its mana cost. So the last payoff here is huge. Very, very good. So, what do I think about last dungeon? So last dungeon for me is obviously for control decks. You can gain some life, you scry a lot, You can ramp, you know, make it so a creature can't attack, get some blockers on the field, just draw 2 cards in the middle of the dungeon, and then last payoff is huge. So this last dungeon is pretty big, right? You need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 triggers to complete it, but in the end you get a huge payoff. And you know, this last dungeon, obviously when you're in a control deck, you might benefit from cards that let you venture into the dungeon multiple times, right? Have kind of like a venture engine. And if you take a look of Ellewick Tumblestone, that is such an engine, right? Because she can plus her every turn to venture into the dungeon, and she has to just do it repeatedly. So, what do I think about this dungeon mechanic? I think it's very unique, a very unique idea. I think it's quite cool. I'm a bit skeptical on how well this is going to play out, because as I said, for aggressive decks, if you can just incidentally go into the dungeon without, you know, sacrificing playing actually good cards, then I think for example, for aggressive decks, the Tomb of Annihilation is very interesting. You just drain your opponents for an additional 5 life the first 3 times, and then in the end you get a 4/4 Death Toucher. Seems really cool. The Lost Mine, for me the Lost Mine is a dungeon which you can complete in any playstyle deck. And you probably go into this dungeon when you basically plan to have benefits from having dungeon completed. Because one thing we haven't talked about here yet is that not only are there going to be cards that let you go into the dungeon, but a lot of cards will have payoffs once you actually completed the dungeon. So if we take a look at Ellewick Tumblestone, right, she has this -7, which is you get an emblem with creatures you control have trample and haste and get +2/+2 for each differently named dungeon you've completed. So once you've completed a dungeon and you have this emblem, your creatures get +2/+2. If you complete another dungeon, your creatures will get +4/+4, right? So there are going to be payoffs for actually going through a dungeon, and nicely, this video also reveals some new cards, namely 2 we have here. So let's talk about this common first, which is Shortcut Seeker. It's a 4-mana 2/5 human rogue, and whenever it deals common damage to play, venture into the dungeon, right? So just very simple design. You deal common damage to your opponent, and then you venture into the dungeon. So obviously not that exciting, because it's obviously not a good creature. Add a common, 4-mana 2/5, and so on. May be interesting for draft. But what's more interesting is, for example, Nadar Selfless Paladin. With a 3-mana 3/3 Dragon Knight, it's legendary, in white, it has Vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield or attacks, venture into the dungeon. And it says other creatures you control get +1/+1 as long as you've completed the dungeon. So right here, we already have a very interesting card, because you get a 3-mana 3/3 with Vigilance, okay, which is obviously it's not exciting, but it's okay. But then when it enters the battlefield, you venture into a dungeon. So if we go back to these dungeons, actually up here, let's just imagine if we take Nadar as an example for a mono-white aggressive deck. If it's possible to rather consistently venture into the dungeon on turn 1 and 2, you could have venture on turn 1 into Tomb of Annihilation, your opponent lost a life. Turn 2, go Veils of Fear, your opponent loses another 2 life because he won't discard a card. Then on turn 3 you play Nadar, and again you venture into the Sandfall Cell, your opponent loses another 2 life. So incidentally, this would already mean that your opponent lost 5 life. And then you play, right, you play Nadar on turn 3, and on turn 4 you can attack with this, venture into a dungeon again, which means you complete it, get a 4/4, and then all your other creatures get +1/+1. Seems very, very powerful. Now obviously, in a current meta, if you're talking about mono white, we have stuff on turn 3 like Skyclave Aberrations or more of the Skyclaves. with which this needs to compete. And I'm not here necessarily to evaluate, to make a card review, like an in-depth card review. I just want to talk about this dungeon mechanic. And those are basically my 2 cents, right? So if you can consistently pull this dungeon mechanic off without sacrificing playing actually good cards, then I think the payoffs can be really, really nice. I think let's also take a look at Lost Mine of Pendle Fear, right? If you can just consistently turn 1 and 2, venture into the dungeon. On turn 2, you might create a treasure token, which means that on turn 3, you'll be able to play a 4-drop. And we already know from Solar Ultimatum, loves to play those Wolf Willow Hazens on turn 2, so they can play Binding the Old Gods on turn 3, right? So the payoffs are very different, very interesting, and I'm just curious to find out how well this mechanic is going to be supported. And with that being said, was there something new here? Oh yeah, there was one new card here, Gloom Stalker, which is another example of a card that gives you payoffs once you've completed the dungeon. So once you've completed the dungeon, it's going to be a 3-mana 2/3 with double strike. And it's a dwarf, right? So it's quite powerful. Maybe not in constructed, but in draft, if you complete a dungeon, a 3-mana 2/3 with double strike seems decent. So those are my 2 cents. In conclusion, I just, with all that knowledge and with all my opinion you've heard about here, I just want to take a quick look at Ellewick Tumblestone, what I think about her. So, like, she's a green planeswalker, lets you venture into the dungeon, and green is in a weird spot because obviously, control decks that have green is Sultai Ultimatum, but Sultai probably doesn't want to play this, I can imagine. And then mono green is an okay deck, but it's not amazing. So could you play this in like a mono green aggressive deck? Again, depends on the rest of the mechanic, right? But if the mechanic is consistent enough, 4-mana follow the Planeswalker that's will venture into the dungeon, which basically means +1, scry, create a token, create a treasure token. I'm not really convinced, actually. -2 lets you grab a card and incidentally gain some life. And the emblem is obviously nice. I mean, giving you creatures trample and haste is very nice, especially the haste part. And, possibly +2/+2 if you play this in the right deck. But then again, I think you can rarely evaluate Planeswalkers on their emblem because most emblems are really, really powerful. But getting there is just very hard. So those are my 2 cents about the dungeon mechanic right now. Was a bit of a rant, but still I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm really excited about the upcoming spoilers, which should start in like 5 days. So hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I see you guys soon. Hey there, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this kind of content and want to see more fresh decks and standard meta decks, please consider subscribing. I would really appreciate it, and I see you guys soon.